Okay, this is lesson 4. What does the Black Death tell us about medieval medicine? So before this lesson, you should have had been sent a link of the homework, and that is due for lesson 4. So we're just gonna quickly just go over the homework, because before you do this lesson, you need to make sure that that homework is done, as that forms the basis of your understanding about the Black Death. So just to kind of explain the homework here, all you're having to do is to read through the information, use your kind of own knowledge and your abilities of research to gain some information and answer the question. So you'd have to read through the information here, and then it literally asks you a bunch of questions. So when did the Black Death arrive in England? That would be 1348. We do have a kind of a way to remember that, and that is 1348. Life's not great. Grab a mate and flagellate. I'll come back to what flagellation actually is. Another question asking you, how did the bubonic plague travel? Symptoms of the plague. What people thought caused the Black Death. What the church believed caused the plague. So thinking about lesson 3 and what we spoke about supernatural thinking. Some consequences of the Black Death. So you might think more literally in terms of death. So that's 40% of the population. You might want to think about what that meant for people's lives. And that information you can actually find here. And then other information that you research about the Black Death using the internet. And that would form the basis of what you need to know about the Black Death. So once you've done that, you can then move on to the lesson. So please make sure that you do that homework before you do this lesson. It gives you a little bit of a summary of what happened. And the big take home here is that it is a plague with an extremely high death rate. People obviously are referring to what they understand as the cause of disease, but this was something that affected people in the Middle Ages. Something that you can quite identify with, because obviously we're living through a time in which coronavirus has come in, it's the unknown, people aren't really sure how to deal with it, and you've got different things in place to deal with that. So in the same way, what we're doing is we're having a look today at the sources, so source A to F, and we're thinking about what does each source suggest the cause of the Black Death actually is. And the way to do that is really think about, does anything in the source remind you of what you already know is a cause that was believed in the Middle Ages? And is anyone suggesting anything from that? So if we were to do source A together, so council regulations from the Italian city of Pistoia, 1348. To stop any contamination presently in the nearby area getting into the bodies of the citizens of Pistoia, no one shall dare to leave the city. And no one can come from outside to the said city of Pistoia on penalty of £50. In order to avoid the foul stench which the bodies of the dead give off, every body must be buried in a deep pit. So over here we see a literal thing that this council of Pistoia is saying to do. And it gives you the reason here. It says to avoid the foul stench. So when you think about what you already know about medieval understanding of cause of disease, you can make that link that people thought that miasma, which is an infected air, causes disease. So in this summary, you can write down how source A suggests that the cause of the Black Death was due to infected air of miasma, which came from, which we see over here, the dead bodies. Who have been infected by the plague. For example, and then of course, whenever you make any inference, you then have to give a quote. So we could use here, avoid the foul stench which the bodies of the dead give off. And that's what you have to literally do for each source. So identify which cause of disease it might be. It might actually not be a particular cause that you've already studied. It might be something else. For example, you could also suggest that the fact that there's this understanding of no one coming into the city or no one leaving the city, there's this understanding of it being spread by that movement. If we have a look at source D, I just want to focus on source D because it's an image. If we look closely at the image, we can see a bunch of people burning, and then the caption saying, a German woodcut showing the burning of Jews in Germany. So an inference that we can make about source C is that people during the Black Death thought that it was due to minority groups, such as the Jews in Germany. And that's what you would summarize here. For example, you could either talk about what it says in the caption, or you could describe parts of the image. Another source that I would like us to kind of think about is what I mentioned before about flagellation. So over here, we have the process of flagellation. So source F is a painting from the time of the Black Death showing a procession of flagellants. Now, if you look closely at the image, we can identify a number of things. So obviously we have a procession, which is this kind of march through the town or the city. We have a cross being held over here, with perhaps Jesus on the cross. That does suggest that the flagellants were a sect of Christianity. Now, if we look really closely, we see the flagellants actually doing something. They're holding something, and on their backs and on their skin, we can see some soreness. So what the flagellants actually, who they were and what they did is they took the idea of atoning for their sins, and they believed that the cause of disease, was definitely supernatural, and it was God sending a punishment through this plague. So what they did, they would hit themselves with a rope. So I think there were ropes over here, and then there were also nails tied to this rope. And they would go through the town hitting themselves on their back. Now again, I'll say that this is only a sect of Christianity, and actually they end up getting banned from doing so by the Pope, who doesn't like the fact that there's this sect who is physically harming themselves in front of people during these processions. And they took the idea of atoning for their sins, and literally asking God for forgiveness in this way. So when you think about the flagellants for source F and the cause of disease, we need to write down here the idea that it is a Christian sect, therefore think about what they would be thinking is the cause of disease, and then describing what they are doing and why they are doing so. And lastly, for today's lesson, actually not lastly, so there's also a bunch of solutions that match up to each cause of disease in the Middle Ages. So we have God, 4 humours, miasma, and planets. We know that those are our 4 causes, so we should already feel very comfortable to identify our supernatural ones and our natural causes. Now, what you have over here is a box full of different solutions, things that people did during the Middle Ages that they believed might help stop the plague or cure themselves from the plague. Whether that's be through processes of prevention, so stopping the plague coming to them, or it's processes of treatment, so curing themselves of the plague or of illness. There might also be a few that might not fall into a particular category. So what you have to do is there's a key already given to you. So you've got God, 4 humors, miasma, and planets. You also have 2 examples here. You just have to reach through each solution and then decide which cause does it match up to. So just looking at the ones that are already done for you. One solution was to prevent dirt from polluting the air and keep the air moving so infected air does not settle. So we know whoever was doing that solution obviously thought that the cause of disease was infected air. Therefore, we put a number 3 there because that's what our key says for infected air miasma. Again, we have a look at the next one. So balance the humors and treat the body using Galen's treatment of opposites. So when we're talking about Galen and his theory, we know that that person who was doing this, who was balancing the humors, is obviously, they believe that the cause of this was the 4 humors. Now, I just want to quickly mention this idea of opposites. So Galen also played with this idea of the theory of opposites. And what he kind of meant by that was, let's say, for example, you were red. When you get ill, you kind of get red, maybe rosy cheeks, feeling really hot. Temperature has increased. Now, this would obviously just be a visible thing. So you'd look at a patient and they'd be red and they'd feel hot. Now, the way that Galen kind of suggested was to literally, treat them by opposite. So give them something cold to eat or to put on them. And that would, in theory, balance that humour. Because if you are red, that may suggest that you, for example, have too much blood. Similarly, if you had too much phlegm, or you looked cold, or you were feeling cold, you were shivering, maybe you're feverish, again, that's being observed by someone in the Middle Ages, they might treat you with something really hot, so maybe a fiery chili. So again, a pretty simple task. All you have to do is read through each one and put the number of whichever cause these solutions match up to. And it's really important that you read through each cause carefully, because this does form the bulk of your sort of evidence when you think of how people prevented or treated disease in the Middle Ages. You should also notice the trend that largely people are thinking about supernatural methods to somehow please God. We're also looking at over here, so we've got, again, other examples at ways that people have either treated the plague or they're trying to prevent it from spreading. So what we have here, just categories, so just like we saw in our source, the idea of blaming Jews, we see government action, superstitious ideas, and other natural ideas. And I'm just going to focus a little bit about government action for a second. So the idea about government action is the government at the time, if you remember from lesson 2, the idea is the government doesn't really take care of, they don't prioritize the health of people in the Middle Ages. So you'll see here, again, you might be able to identify with this because of the time that we live in now, they enforced quarantine laws to stop people moving. And they did try to prevent it. But generally, we're going to see in the Middle Ages and a little bit in the Renaissance period as well that the government aren't really doing a lot for health and medicine in these timeframes. So what you have to do is just identify which 2 are treatments and which 2 are attempts to prevent the plague spreading. And then lastly, you have here an exam practice. So when we do exam practice for medicine, throughout the GCSE course, actually, we see a question that is called the explain why question. So over here, our explain why question is, explain why there was a dependence upon supernatural explanations for illness in Britain during the period 1250 to 1500. The first task that you have to do here is have a look at the example paragraph and highlight key evidence from the example paragraph, and then highlight the connective words explaining why there was a dependence on supernatural explanations. Now, when you see an explain why question in a GCSE exam, you're also given this box here. This will be a box that gives you two kind of prompts, but then it also asks that you use your information of your own. So it's important that you make sure that you don't limit yourself just to these points. You need to be sure to add information of your own. Do not limit yourself just to this. So again, let's have a look at the question. Explain why there was a dependence upon supernatural explanations for illness in Britain during the period 1250 to 1500. So all this question is asking you is, why did people rely on supernatural explanations for illness? So why was that? How come they thought that God was punishing them? So to answer this question, you really need to be thinking about what life was like in the Middle Ages. Now your prompts here are really helpful. So over here we have the dominance of the Catholic Church, the inability to stop the plague. If we think about what life was like in the Middle Ages, you can also think about why else people might be depending on supernatural explanation. So who is in charge to be pressing forward this idea that, it is God who is sending down this as punishment? Obviously, we know that's the Catholic Church. So that is already a prompt that we can kind of talk through, the idea of the dominance of the Catholic Church. But maybe we can go further. And if we look back to, again, our idea of what life was like in the Middle Ages, we can think about, can we see any other factors of why people might rely on this supernatural explanation and rely on the Bible, the Catholic Church? And you should be able to identify the factor of education. Now, education is really important because if the church, which we know in the Middle Ages did, controlled education, they are essentially controlling the idea of where disease comes from. So if we go back down here again, we can also here for you must use your own information, we can decide to use education as a factor. I mentioned how because there was this Catholic Church, people didn't really want to oppose the Catholic Church. But if we think back to our idea of medicine factors, we should also be able to identify that attitudes in society, they weren't there to seek improvement. No one was there to kind of change things. So if we'll look through the model paragraph together. So just to kind of highlight how you write and explain why question, over here on our first page, we have here what you should really be doing. So I'm just going to change that and you can do that in your booklet as well. An explain why question is roughly around 17 minutes. It's 12 marks for an explain why question. What that means is that 6 marks for 2 paragraphs. You can honestly get 12 marks writing 2 paragraphs, but if you have time, you can do 3. Now, what you need to make sure when you answer your explain why question is you need to prescribe importance. So you need to make sure that your first paragraph starts off with the most important reason why, and your second paragraph would start with another reason why. Just wait, let's move back down here. Now, you should be familiar with the idea of what petal is, but if you're not, I'm going to write down here what we mean by petal. So P is obviously your point. And in an explain why question, we know that since we're prescribing importance, our point will start off with like the most important reason. And then generally, when you write any sort of answer to a question, you need to make sure there is focus on the question. So let's reword the question in our first sentence. So the most important reason, there was a dependence upon supernatural explanation for illness was because, and then you need to try to make sure with your explain why questions that your factors of medicine are driving your answer. So in reference to this, already we can see some factors that would have caused this would be the Catholic Church, education, and attitudes in society. So we can write down here the dominance of the Catholic Church. Once you've done your P for petal, it's E, so that's obviously evidence. So you need to think about, how does the Catholic Church dominate in England in the Middle Ages? You can think about the idea that there was, that in each town there was a bishop. You can talk about how education, and especially university, which control where doctors would go to university to study about health and medicine, the church controlled that education. You could talk about how the Bible was written in Latin. So people relied on the church to understand the Bible itself. So how to live their daily lives. Or the stained glass windows in the church to understand what is right and what is wrong. So once you think of some evidence and find evidence in your booklet, you write down obviously sentence starter, for example. Now your T in petal, sometimes you can write this meant that. So you need to explain why your evidence shows that there is a dependence. Or you can write this was important because. So you need to tell us, why does this dominance of the Catholic Church mean there was a dependence upon supernatural explanations? So for example, you need to think, well, if education was controlled by the church, then people who study health, so doctors, they're the ones who are telling patients what to do when they're treating them. They would obviously refer to supernatural explanations because that's what they were taught, because that's what's approved by the Catholic Church. And you need to word this in a way that shows your clear analysis. You need to go further in your analysis and say as a result. So the next sentence starter would be as a result. And you need to go on further and explain, well, if that's happening, so if that shows dependence, what else might happen after that? What might that lead to? And then lastly, your link. Your link is, we're going to start with the sentence therefore, and your link should be worded very similarly to your point, because to make sure that you are gaining that mark for analysis, we need to really make sure there's focus on the question. So you'd say, therefore, there was a dependence upon supernatural explanations for illness because. Okay. Just before we finish today's lesson, we're just going to have a look at the mark scheme here. So to make sure you get 10 to 12, so we're looking at the highest level here in this question, so level 4. Paragraphs are clearly structured and focused on one clear point. So again, if you use your factors to drive your point, that will be able to happen. The answer is directed at the question at all times. Do not let your examiner or whoever's marking your work feel like you do not understand the focus of your question. Remember what it's asking you. It's asking you, why was there dependence upon supernatural explanations for illness in Britain during this time? So during the Middle Ages, why did people believe in supernatural explanation for illness so much? These are equal, so what that means is your analysis is equal to your knowledge. So analysis is AO2, so that would be your this meant that and as a result, and your knowledge is AO1. So if we just quickly read what it says in the mark scheme for AO1, accurate and relevant information is precisely selected to answer the question directly. Wide-ranging knowledge is used. There is a clear understanding of the topics that need to be discussed for the question. 3 different topics or reasons are explained. At least one reason must not be based upon one of the bullet points given at the beginning of the question. So again, I'll highlight that you need to use your own information. So you can talk about 2 bullet points if you wanted in one paragraph, and then something else in another paragraph if you don't have time to write 3, but you need to make sure that you are not limited to this. So if we look at this paragraph over here, I don't think it necessarily follows the idea of petal, but we'll still read it anyway to find out what is the evidence for this example paragraph and the connective words. So there was a considerable dependence upon supernatural explanations for illness during the Middle Ages. One key reason for this is because medieval people were often unable to stop or cure illness. So that makes perfect sense, and it's one of our points over here. So the inability to stop the plague. People didn't understand how to cure it. So they thought it was something that transcends them, something that's bigger than themselves. So they refer to supernatural explanation, because if they can't cure it, if they don't know where it's coming from, then surely this is coming from God. Again, keep in mind that the Middle Ages were a Christian society at the time. The Black Death first struck England in 1348, precise, and caused widespread fear and death, sweeping from town to town, killing some 40% of the population. As no human could stop the plague, it was reasoned that God must be behind the disease. Consequently, many people looked to religion to help them survive the plague. So looking to religion is key, and would do things such as going on pilgrimage to the tomb of saints and to pray for God's forgiveness. Thus, because of people's helplessness, they returned to religion to help them. So over here, I've kind of outlined the evidence, but if we just see again, so just reading that, there was evidence, a bit of analysis, evidence, a bit of analysis. So our words for the connected words explaining why there was dependence, we would say that's consequently, thus, and this technically is also, while that's not a connective word, this is clearly a connective sentence. So once you've done that, and once you've kind of listened to this lesson, you need to try to at least write one paragraph about answering this question. So the first paragraph of the dominance of the Catholic Church is an easy one to do. So use that, using the sentence starters below. Try to write down an answer to the question above on paper or on Word, and then you can just email it to your teacher, who will be happy to look through it with you. Okay, thank you.